the housing burden is starting to become backbreaking.
A record-smashing 25% of Canadians live in poverty.
Continue to delve into medically assisted dying and how some believe it is their only option to living in poverty.
Did you ever overdose on fentanyl at all?
I've been known to overdose twice before, 3 times.
There's one substance that has gone down in price by 90%. Powerful opioids.
Canada has become a dystopian nightmare. No, that's not the premise of an outlandish futuristic sci-fi film. It's the daily reality for many everyday Canadians. To the outside world, the nation boasts a sterling reputation for fairness, human rights, and a high quality of life. But sadly, this is no longer the reality on the ground. The past decade, especially the last 5 years, have seen middle-class Canadians' quality of life plummet, with many seeking to leave the nation altogether. Canadians are being squeezed on all sides by skyrocketing housing costs, a cost of living crisis, surging household debt, a collapsing healthcare system, and massive numbers of new immigrants driving down wages. Carbon taxes make commuting to work unaffordable, and to top it off, the federal government attempts to stifle dissent by controlling news and social media. Unfortunately, Canada is the land of make-believe. What really matters doesn't get discussed, and what gets discussed doesn't really matter. Political leaders from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on down endlessly preach about divisive cultural issues related to race, diversity, gender identity, and trans rights, issues with little impact on the day-to-day lives of ordinary citizens. And so we must ask ourselves, what happened? What changed that led Canada down this dark path? And how can we learn to prevent this from happening elsewhere? Before we can fully explore the current situation, it helps to understand why Canada was uniquely positioned for the type of breakdown we are currently witnessing. Most nations have a founding myth, a romanticized story about their origin that offers important national symbols and affirms a set of shared values. The United States has George Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas morning, taming the boundless frontier of the Wild West, and defeating the Axis in World War II. Japan has their first emperor Jimmu, said to be the descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. And many nations, including India, Egypt, and Ireland, share part of their founding myth as rising up and throwing out the British Empire. But Canada never had a strong founding myth. They didn't rebel against the British. Rather, they politely asked permission to leave in 1867 and didn't achieve complete independence until approval by the British Parliament in 1982. As a result, Canada's origin story is deeply intertwined with that of Britain's. The Dominion of Canada fought alongside the British Empire during the Second Boer War, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. Canadian forces fought admirably during these conflicts, earning a reputation as tough, well-trained, and skillful soldiers. The decline of the British Empire post-World War II meant that Canada's national identity as British loyalists also declined. The nation needed a new founding myth to unite around, leading Canada to adopt a new national identity: multiculturalism. The Multiculturalism Act of 1971, pushed by Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, stated that the policies of bilingualism and multiculturalism would be implemented in Canada. Except there's only one problem. Canada was never a multicultural society. The overwhelming majority of Canadians at the time descended from British, Irish, and French settlers, with less than 10% coming from elsewhere. The issue with this is not so much the passing of the bill, but rather the disillusion of the Canadian identity. Multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multi-religious nations can certainly succeed, but need a founding myth, symbols, and a shared identity for cohesion. In other words, a successful nation needs a shared culture, something inherently antithetical to multiculturalism. The passing of this bill created a new Canada without its traditional identity. The nation was now an open book and would become a testing ground for all manner of progressive ideas in the coming decades. Perhaps nothing has had a greater impact on Canada's current predicament than its recent population explosion. While most industrialized nations are experiencing plummeting birth rates and stagnating populations, Canada's population is skyrocketing. This rapid rise isn't due to birth rates, though. Canada, though not widely known, has the highest immigration levels among industrialized nations. In 2023, 97.6% of population growth was the result of immigration. In 2023, the nation's population grew by a staggering 1.2 million people. an astonishing 3.2% increase in a single year. Such levels haven't been seen since the 1950s, during the peak of the baby boom, while boatloads of refugees fleeing war-torn Europe washed up on Canada's shores. To paint a picture of how insane these numbers are, if you extrapolate these figures to the United States, this would equate to approximately 11 million immigrants in a single year. So why is Canada bringing in record numbers of immigrants? There are two possible answers to this question, the generous one and the more sinister one. Canada, like many other nations, faces labor shortages, particularly in the skilled trades and healthcare. New immigrants are seen as a solution to fill these gaps in the labor market and prepare for the upcoming baby boomer retirement. And now the more sinister one. Bringing in waves of immigrants can also serve to bolster a faltering economy. Housing demand continues at a scorching pace as more people compete for a fixed number of housing units. Even more disturbing is the creation of a new peasant class willing to work for less money and under poorer conditions, a situation long sought after by large corporate interests. Many of this new group immigrated to Canada under the notoriously loose student visa system, which allows students to work full-time and even purchase real estate while enrolled in school. This system is rife with abuse, with huge numbers of these students enrolled in so-called diploma mills, private colleges with no-show students skirting the immigration laws. Lastly, as the Liberal Party of Canada is the group behind this mass wave of immigration, the thinking is these new arrivals will vote for the same party that brought them here. This brings us to the next major issue facing Canada, the housing bubble. It's difficult to overstate the degree to which Canada's housing bubble has affected every aspect of Canadian life. Buying a home in major Canadian cities is now a privilege reserved for millionaires. This might sound like an exaggeration, so let's break it down in depth. The average home in Toronto in 2024 sold for $1.16 million. In Vancouver, $1.35. Montreal was slightly lower at $607,883. Homes priced over $1 million require a 20% down payment, meaning prospective buyers need $232,000 for the average home in Toronto or $270,000 in Vancouver. Keep in mind these figures include condos and townhouses, so the cost of a detached house would be significantly higher. These are astronomical sums for young people looking to purchase their first home and essentially put buying a home out of reach for young Canadians without wealthy families willing to help out with the down payment. And there's more to this story than just sky-high prices. More than anywhere else in the developed world, Canada's housing market is a speculator's paradise. Unlike the United States, Canada never experienced the forced correction of the subprime mortgage crisis and its resulting recession in the housing market. While US investors were forced to change their view of housing as a risk-free market, Canadian investors have yet to learn this lesson. As a result, the housing market has inflated to astronomical levels.
Canada could be sitting on the biggest housing bubble of all time.
Over the last 2 decades, housing prices in Toronto and Vancouver have inflated by 450 and 490% respectively. Couple this with mind-boggling levels of household debt and you have a massively over-leveraged credit bubble on the brink of disaster. Given the gravity of the housing situation, you would think that the government would lower its sky-high immigration targets and begin expediting new home construction to help the situation. Well, you'd be wrong on both counts. The Trudeau government is stubbornly sticking to its plan of bringing in 485,000 permanent residents in 2024 and 500,000 in both 2025 and 2026. Keep in mind, these figures don't include international student visas. When included, these numbers easily top 1 million annually. As far as the housing supply side goes, while it's true that the federal government doesn't control local land use planning and zoning, those are under provincial and municipal control, there's still plenty the federal government could do, should it wish. This includes prioritizing immigrants with construction and skilled trade backgrounds, requiring universities to build new housing for incoming students, and directly constructing public non-market housing, something the federal government did heavily in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Instead, the government's response has been to shift blame and announce a paltry $45 million investment to construct 214 rental units in Hamilton, Ontario. To say this is a slap in the face is an understatement. While the above-mentioned issues are having major negative impacts on the lives of everyday Canadians, one could argue that they are simply the results of incompetence and mismanagement by the federal leadership. However, there exists something more sinister going on within Canada, impossible to attribute to mere incompetence. In June 2016, Canada passed the Medical Assistance in Dying Act, known as MAID. This act legalized euthanasia, initially only for terminally ill individuals. In the following years, the act was expanded to people with chronic medical conditions and even to those with chronic mental illnesses. Since the act's passing, the level of Canadians choosing to end their lives under MAID has been astonishing. MAID now accounts for 4.1% of all deaths in Canada. No other country has experienced this level of precipitous growth after implementing similar legislation. California, with a similar population to Canada, also granted access to medically assisted dying in 2016, and currently has more than 10 times fewer people going through with the process. In 2022, 853 Californians ended their lives with MAID, compared to 13,241 in Canada. While one could make a moral argument for the legality of such a procedure in certain terminal cases involving severe suffering, there are now numerous documented cases of Canadians living in poverty due to disabilities seeking out MAID as a preferable alternative, and physicians are signing off on it. It appears that getting rid of these people is a cheaper alternative to helping them live with dignity. This brings us to the next sinister act being pushed by the Canadian federal government: the regulated distribution of hard drugs, including cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and even fentanyl. The program is called Safer Supply and allows drug users to walk into a government clinic and receive hard drugs. The justification for the program is that by providing drug users with pure versions of these substances, the number of accidental overdoses due to adulterated street drugs will be reduced. However, by providing users with dangerous substances, the government is in effect sanctioning addiction and increasing the level of homelessness, addiction, and crime. Problems already at epidemic levels in major cities like Vancouver and Toronto. What both of these programs have in common is a form of pathological altruism that has infected the Canadian psyche. They both sound compassionate on paper, and in Canada, the highest virtue one can have is compassion, or being nice. Never mind that vulnerable people are now dying in droves thanks directly to government actions. Dystopian societies are characterized by a loss of individuality, oppression, fear, and hopelessness. However, for a society like this to exist, leadership must convince the people that they are better off under the system. To accomplish this, the role of propaganda is vital, while dissenting opinions must be censored or disallowed completely. Of course, accomplishing this in the internet age is significantly more challenging than during the days of Pravda in the Soviet Union. Enter Canada's Bill C11 and Bill C18. Bill C11 updates Canada's broadcast laws to give the CRTC, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, the power to regulate online streaming platforms like Netflix, YouTube, and Amazon Prime. Ostensibly, this bill is being used to promote Canadian content, something the CRTC historically did during the dominance of radio and television. However, in effect, the legislation would give the CRTC the power to prohibit foreign content from being shown within Canada. They'll be empowered to push content that promotes the government's agenda. Meanwhile, Bill C18 forces online media like Facebook and Google to pay Canadian news organizations for merely linking to their content. Effectively, this is yet another subsidy to prop up failing legacy Canadian news outlets currently being kept on life support by massive government bailouts. According to University of Ottawa professor Michael Geist, Bill C18 is shamefully overbroad, an embarrassment to the news media lobby that demanded it, and unworthy of a government that sees itself as a model for the rest of the world on media freedoms. With these two bills, Canada will have one of the most heavily regulated and controlled internet environments in the entire world. However, Bill C18 has already started backfiring. Rather than negotiating fees with Canadian news outlets for the privilege of linking to them, in August 2023, Meta announced they started removing news articles from Facebook and Instagram for users within Canada. Google followed suit in June by planning to remove links to Canadian news sites from search results within Canada. And here we witness perhaps the first glimmer of hope. The age of the internet has allowed freedom of information across national borders to an extent never seen in human history. Despite the government's efforts, these attempts to control what Canadians can view and read are likely to fail. And without control over information, the government will ultimately lose the battle over what Canadians can think and feel. Signs of a backlash against Trudeau's long 9-year reign are already happening. Recent polls show a massive lead for Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre, even in traditional Liberal strongholds like Toronto. The vitriol for Trudeau among all segments of Canadian society is palpable, reflected in his approval rating tanking to just 28% in April 2024. And so the question becomes if the likely next Conservative government can right the sinking ship and salvage what remains of a once prosperous, free, and fair nation. Only time will tell, but one thing is certain: the challenge is an enormous one, and the hour grows increasingly late. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and watching one of these 2 videos next.